A jet engine tore itself sideways across the skyline when Homelander's descent cracked the air above Fifth Avenue, scattering glass from a building that had not yet realized it was part of a live incident, and the shockwave rolled down the street hard enough to flip parked cars onto their sides. The first laser strike carved a molten trench through the asphalt before anyone understood why it had been fired, and the cameras that arrived expecting a rescue instead found a man in a yellow suit standing at a crosswalk, as if the light still mattered. A train's approach distorted the air into a visible wake that struck him from behind. Queen Maeve's landing split the pavement beneath his feet, and the combined force of a coordinated takedown plan detonated against someone who did not appear to notice that it had begun. The crowd ran, alarms screamed, and Homelander's second pass lit the street like a welding torch that refused to stop. This is not a misunderstanding that will resolve itself, because he hasn't realized they're attacking him yet. This is only the beginning, and it gets worse from here. Subscribe once and keep listening, because what happens next will force you to watch how escalation grows when the target doesn't react, and the consequences won't be something the Seven can walk back later. The street answered to Homelander's arrival with a noise like a jet taking a breath too close to pavement, a sound that shredded the afternoon into a dozen smaller emergencies at once, and the first sensible reaction from anyone in the crowd was to move before they understood why. Queen Maeve's descent split the air with a hardness learned from collapsing small buildings, and A-Train blurred past like a living blur of displaced wind that shoved coffee cups into fountains and phones out of hands. Cameras swung as one toward the man in the yellow suit standing at the crosswalk, checking the back of his hand, as if his life depended on seeing whether a smudge would wash out with soap. And the composition was already wrong for Vought because the brand expectations of arrival, Boeing, and public gratitude were missing from every angle. People screamed. Alarms threw half-formed instructions into the air, and the planned choreography of a public takedown folded in real time into improvisation because the target did not behave like a target. Homelander spoke first, with a voice tuned for live feeds and absolute statements, and he delivered a demand that was as much a press release as an order. Stand down. The man in yellow did not look up so much as rotate his head the way you turn a faucet handle when your hands are full, and he answered that he was only trying to get to the supermarket before it closed, which registered on 3 separate open mics, and then spread faster than the scripted line the PR team had rehearsed. Maeve moved to flank in case this was a misdirection, hands ready to lift or catch whatever the encounter produced, and A-Train circled with the practiced impatience of someone whose job required discomfort for ratings. The first wave of physical engagement unfolded like a test in which every measured variable failed to mean what the engineers had promised. Homelander's heat vision seared the crosswalk where the man had stood a moment before, but the trench of molten light did not find a body to mark. The Seven escalated because escalation is their language, and their training pushed them into it as reflexively as a tide follows the moon. Homelander increased intensity, Maeve used concussive force to clear a line of civilians, and A-Train's kinetic blur attempted to pin movement to a point. Where an ordinary opponent would crumple, where every casualty-free restraint would read as success, the yellow-suited civilian treated the unfolding calamity like a minor inconvenience that might interfere with a dinner plan, and his nonchalance rewired immediate expectation into a new problem. A scaffolding that had been loose in the wind found itself compacted under a displaced load when Maeve's sweep caught it mid-fall and redirected debris toward a bakery window, and the glass sheared in a way that sent sparks into an exposed gas main a block away. The physical violence of the takedown had begun to do its own work independent of intent. What was supposed to be a contained operation became a generator of secondary failures, and no one in the command van could say the contagion would stop at this intersection. Saitama kept looking for a store with cheap eggs, while firefighters pushed through the first plume and medics checked pulses on people struck by cracked pavement. And the fact that he explained his mundanity into a live microphone only made the mismatch more grotesque on social feeds. Ashley Barrett's voice hit the earpieces with the legal framing that always precedes a brand salvage, demanding a narrative that put Homelander at the center of the outcome and defined the presence of an unaffiliated civilian as cooperative assistance rather than unscheduled intervention. Homelander answered on channel and camera both, his tone clipped and controlled because cameras expect control. But as he did, the heat vision tracked a flinch from the crowd and burned through a hydraulic line on a maintenance truck waiting at the curb. Oil and gas hissed together in a way that did not remain tidy when confronted with flame, and the town's first true casualty was not a person or a soup, but a system. The gas feed to a small block's worth of businesses, whose failure would not be reversed by a soundbite. The image of the Seven doubled as both protector and cause now began to migrate across feeds into something more complex. Because what the public saw live was not a hero saving a scene from danger, but a branded team whose tactics amplified harm when the person they targeted did not play along. A train, used to crowds that cheered simply for movement, felt the change in the air as phones stopped clapping and started sharing frames that asked the question the PR team hadn't prepared for. Why is the man in yellow more effective by accident than the system is by design? Maeve's jaw tightened in a way the camera could read as both frustration and calculation, and Homelander hovered with a posture that carried the old authority but none of the easy narrative closure. Ashley ordered containment. Legal started lining up emergency waivers. A field liaison radioed for backup that had not yet deployed because the definition of backup assumes a threat that is being actively resisted. By the time the firefighters pushed a hose into position, the rupture in the gas main had already interacted with a live electrical conduit exposed in the same blast, and the result was a cascading outage that spread down the block faster than responders could cordon. The first transformer that fed the intersection blew with a purity of sound that no one mistook for anything but failure, and basement generators across nearby buildings tried to compensate in a sequence that threw the city's redundancy plan into temporary paralysis. Homelander barked orders that used to restore calm, but there was no single lever left to pull. Equipment had been damaged in ways that required time, spares, and an engineering response that could not be manufactured for a live camera cycle. The Seven's attempted neutralization had produced something irretrievable in the short term. A ruptured infrastructure triangle, gas, power, and communications, whose repair would take hours or days rather than minutes, and the downtown pulse had already shifted from controlled emergency to systemic hazard. Saitama stepped back from the curb because the smell of frying dumplings had been replaced by something harsher, and he asked in a voice that cut through the roar whether anyone knew if the supermarket up the avenue accepted coupons, which landed on the feeds like a joke in a room that had stopped laughing. The cameras panned to Homelander for the reaction that would traditionally rebind the story, but Homelander's face was a study in a different problem. The person he had been trained to command could not be made to respond by threat or spectacle, and that incapacity began to unmoor the brand more effectively than any scandal. The crowd that had come to watch heroes had somewhere else to direct their rage now, at the visible consequences of the confrontation. And the first chant that named the Seven came not from a place of gratitude but accusation, which is an escalation that public relations cannot repair with a single statement. Sirens became strategy in real time, as municipal command decided to treat the intersection as a priority evacuation zone rather than a photo opportunity. And the first lines of police tape went up, while utility crews attempted triage on systems that had been unintentionally weaponized. A train accelerated into a sweep that pushed people clear as best he could, Maeve coordinated lifts to clear obstructed storefronts, and Homelander attempted to reframe the encounter with the same calm brevity that had always worked. But the infrastructure damage would not be reversed by an apology. The man in the yellow suit walked away because the bakery's doors were open and he wanted to taste a sample, and he left behind a city that had been subtly and irreversibly altered in the space of an afternoon by a takedown that succeeded at the only thing it did not intend, making the heroes look both necessary and culpable at once. The outage did not stay local, which was the first indication to Municipal Command that the takedown had created a cascading systems problem rather than a contained street-level emergency, and the grid's attempt to reroute load into adjacent districts produced a brownout that spread faster than responders could isolate. Emergency lighting flickered on in buildings that had not planned for simultaneous failures, and elevator banks halted between floors with people inside who could hear the shouting below but could not move toward it. Homelander's voice moved through the air with practiced reassurance as he directed Maeve to secure the gas rupture, while A-Train cleared a wider perimeter. Yet every instruction now had to compete with a live feed that showed the man in the yellow suit drifting toward an open bakery as if the scene had concluded. Ashley Barrett's voice cut across their earpieces with the legal framing that would follow them for the rest of the day, insisting that the narrative emphasize cooperation with an unregistered responder rather than an attempted neutralization that had escalated beyond design. The bakery's front windows were gone where Maeve's earlier sweep had redirected debris, and the staff inside were trying to move racks of bread away from a sagging support that had shifted when the transformer blew. Saitama asked if the samples were still available because he had walked a long way, and the owner nodded without looking up from the beam he was bracing with a shoulder that was already trembling. When Saitama placed a hand against the support to keep it from leaning further, the vibration that had been traveling through the frame settled into something manageable, and the baker's hand stopped shaking enough to slide a tray clear of the path. Outside, Homelander felt the change in load without understanding its cause, and the line of police tape that had been bowing inward under pressure held long enough for medics to move a stretcher through. The 7 escalated again, because escalation is how they restore sequence, and Homelander took to the air with a second pass that cut through the smoke to assess whether the yellow-suited civilian was intentionally interfering with containment. A train sweep widened into the next block, where the brownout had stalled traffic at a 4-way that now ignored the lights entirely, and Maeve's lift brought a section of broken signage clear of a fire hydrant that had begun to flood the curb. The cameras followed all of it because there was no single frame left that could summarize the event, and the commentary that had once been predictable now fractured into competing interpretations that the PR team could not stitch together. A field liaison radioed that the public was treating the bakery intervention as the true save, and Ashley demanded a repositioning that would bring Homelander back into the center of the story. The repositioning arrived in the form of a second structural alert 2 blocks north, where a parking garage had partially collapsed under the load shift from the grid failure, and the evacuation routed to Vought with priority status. Homelander landed at the breach with the calm that had always returned a narrative to its intended shape, and Maeve followed to secure a ramp that had begun to tilt under a line of vehicles. A train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as bystanders pushed closer for a view, and the first drone camera to arrive framed the scene with the expectation of a lift that would trend. Inside the garage, a support column had cracked in a way that trapped a family between a concrete lip and a car that had rolled into their exit. Saitama arrived because the bakery owner had pointed toward a market up the avenue that might still accept coupons, and he paused when he saw the family struggling with the door that had jammed during the shift. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, lifting the concrete lip enough to clear the wheels without comment, and the column's crack did not widen when the weight redistributed. Maeve noticed the change before the sensors did and moved to guide the family through while emergency crews shouted for distance. And Homelander's hand on the ramp found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. The cameras that had come for a branded lift lingered on a motion that did not match the force being applied. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a priority response, and legal began drafting language that would define assistance as leadership without implying fault. The mayor's office requested clarification on whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the liaison advised that the brownout now affected hospital generators 3 districts away. A train watched the family move past Saitama without recognizing him, and he reported that the crowd's phones remained pointed in the wrong direction. Outside, the garage continued to settle as engineers assessed whether it could be stabilized, and the news choppers circled a scene that had already begun to resolve. Homelander thanked Saitama for assisting with a smile that cameras could read, and Saitama asked whether the market down the street might still be open, because he had already missed the egg sale. The question carried across a block that had lost power, and the silence that followed was filled by sirens that did not know where to go first. By the time the parking garage evacuation had cleared the last trapped vehicle, the outage had matured into a multi-district incident that forced municipal command to treat the downtown core as a systems failure rather than a sequence of isolated emergencies. And that distinction altered who was allowed to make decisions in the field. Vaught's liaison requested operational authority on the basis that the 7 were already deployed, while the city's grid operator warned that load had begun to drift into substations that had not been rated for emergency rerouting, and hospital generators were now running in a configuration that would not hold through the night. Ashley Barrett's voice cut across the command channel with instructions to frame the day's events as coordinated response in partnership with an unregistered civilian, yet the timestamps that legal attempted to align would not cooperate with the footage already circulating online. Homelander watched the analytics panel populate with sentiment that did not respond to ad placement, and he asked whether the public could be convinced that cooperation had been intentional. Inside the tower, a task group assembled to determine whether emergency designation could be extended retroactively to incorporate Saitama into Vaught's liability framework, because assistance without affiliation created a gap in ownership that the company had never had to manage. Maeve reported that the brownout now affected a surgical wing 3 districts away, and A-Train relayed that traffic signals across Midtown had entered fallback mode simultaneously, producing gridlock that impeded evacuation routes. The liaison recommended a temporary integration order that would compel cooperation in the interest of public safety, while legal prepared language that implied consent through action. Homelander agreed to the optics, provided that the next live response would place him at the center of the outcome. The next response arrived sooner than anyone preferred when a chemical distributor on the west side reported a containment failure in a storage bay that shared a feed with the same gas network ruptured earlier, and the hazard classification triggered both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve coordinated with hazmat crews to establish a perimeter, while A-Train cleared a path through traffic that had begun to ignore the lights entirely, and Homelander descended with the expectation that this would be a visible reassertion of control. The plume that rose from the bay carried a classification that would normally close a block for hours, and the first responders shouted for distance as bystanders pressed for a view. Saitama arrived because the route toward the market ran past the distributor's loading dock, and he paused when he saw a worker trying to free a coworker from a pallet that had slid during the shift. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, lifting the load enough to clear the man's leg without comment, and the hiss from the ruptured line softened as if the system had decided to wait. When Homelander landed seconds later, the first person he saw was the same man stepping back to ask whether the store around the corner accepted coupons after 6. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a federal response, and legal began drafting language that would redefine assistance as operational leadership, without implying fault. The mayor's office requested clarification on whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the liaison advised that the chemical plume had begun to drift toward a residential block. A train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as residents pushed closer for a view, and the cameras that had come for a branded containment lingered on a motion that did not match the force being applied. Back at the tower, the analytics dashboard registered a sentiment drop that correlated with each clip of Saitama acting independently, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer in similar scenarios. Homelander asked whether deferral would play on camera, and Ashley replied that relevance was a prerequisite for optics. Maeve noted that the footage from the distributor showed the plume settling without corresponding equipment deployment, and the liaison recommended an immediate review of jurisdiction. While the bay was brought under control, a secondary alert triggered at a transit hub where the brownout had stalled trains between stations, and the evacuation routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the market he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a group of commuters trying to pry open a jammed carriage door. He asked if they needed help and pulled it free enough to clear the platform without comment, and the emergency lighting steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The commuters moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized the temporary integration order as an emergency measure that would take effect immediately, and the liaison transmitted the documentation to field teams with instructions to make contact. The analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding, and the sentiment curve dipped again. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a transit worker pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. The temporary integration order moved through channels faster than anyone expected, not because it had been refined, but because the field teams no longer had a better option for explaining why an unaffiliated civilian kept appearing at the center of responses that were routed to the 7 by default. Municipal Command accepted the order as a procedural bridge, while the legal teams debated ownership, and the grid operator reported that the earlier brownout had begun to propagate along feeders that had never shared a transformer. Elevator banks stalled in buildings outside the original outage zone, and a hospital's imaging suite shut down mid-scan when its backup failed to synchronize with the emergency configuration. Ashley Barrett instructed the brand team to emphasize coordination in all live feeds, yet the clips that reached the public showed the same man in a yellow suit stepping out of frame as systems steadied behind him. Homelander redirected to a residential tower where the power loss had trapped residents in stairwells that now doubled as smoke chimneys for a small electrical fire, and Maeve coordinated with firefighters to clear a landing that had buckled under the rush. A train moved ahead to secure the perimeter through an intersection that had begun to cycle randomly, and the liaison confirmed that the integration order applied to municipal evacuations. The cameras framed the landing with the expectation of a lift that would trend, and the first responders shouted for distance as a section of railing gave way. Saitama arrived because the street he had taken toward an open market passed beneath the tower, and he paused when he saw a man trying to guide his mother down a stairwell where the steps had shifted. He asked if they needed help and steadied the frame enough to clear the obstruction without comment, and the landing settled back into place with a sound that did not match the force applied. Maeve noticed the change before the sensors did, and moved to guide the pair through while emergency crews shouted for distance. And Homelander's hand on the railing found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a municipal evacuation, and Legal revised the integration language to include situational leadership, without implying transfer of authority. The mayor's office requested clarification on whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the liaison advised that the brownout had now affected a water treatment facility on the east side. A train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as bystanders pushed closer for a view, and the cameras that had come for a branded rescue lingered on a motion that did not match the force being applied. Back at the tower, the analytics dashboard registered a sentiment drop that correlated with each clip of Saitama acting independently, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer in similar scenarios. Homelander asked whether deferral would play on camera, and Ashley replied that relevance was a prerequisite for optics. Maeve noted that the footage from the stairwell showed the frame settling without corresponding equipment deployment, and the liaison recommended an immediate review of jurisdiction. While the tower evacuation cleared, a secondary alert triggered at the treatment facility, where a valve failure threatened to flood a low-lying district, and the response routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through traffic that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the market he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to close a manual gate that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the water level steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The technicians moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a revised messaging package that would redefine leadership as facilitation, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again, as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an immediate policy update. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. By early evening, the temporary integration order had moved beyond a legal instrument into an operational habit, because municipal teams were already coordinating with whoever was present rather than waiting for the Seven to arrive and establish command. And that shift forced federal oversight to consider whether jurisdiction could be maintained without visible leadership. The mayor's office requested National Guard support when the brownout began to affect traffic control along an evacuation corridor, and the liaison confirmed that the request would route through a joint task group already monitoring the day's incidents. Ashley Barrett authorized the deployment on the condition that Vought retain narrative primacy in all public statements, yet the clips that reached the networks showed responders moving in sync with a man who did not appear to be listening to anyone's instructions. Homelander redirected to a freight yard where a tanker had lost containment during the grid fluctuation, and Maeve coordinated with hazmat crews to establish a perimeter that extended into a residential block. A train cleared a path for emergency vehicles through traffic that had begun to ignore the lights entirely, and the guard's first convoy arrived with equipment designed to stabilize spills that normally waited for Vaught's sign-off. The plume that rose from the rupture carried a classification that would usually close the area for hours, and the field commander requested confirmation that the integration order applied to military support. Saitama arrived because the route toward an open market intersected with the yard, and he paused when he saw a forklift operator trying to free a coworker pinned beneath a crate that had shifted during the crash. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, lifting the load enough to clear the man's leg without comment, and the hiss from the ruptured line softened as if the system had decided to wait. Maeve noticed the change before the sensors did and moved to guide the stretcher through while hazmat crews shouted for distance, and Homelander's hand on the tanker found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a military response, and Legal revised the integration language to include federal coordination without implying transfer of authority. The field commander requested clarification on whether guard resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the liaison advised that the plume had begun to drift toward a school. A train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as residents pushed closer for a view, and the cameras that had come for a branded containment lingered on a motion that did not match the force being applied. Back at the tower, the analytics dashboard registered a sentiment drop that correlated with each clip of Saitama acting independently, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer in similar scenarios. Homelander asked whether deferral would play on camera, and Ashley replied that relevance was a prerequisite for optics. Maeve noted that the footage from the yard showed the plume settling without corresponding equipment deployment, and the liaison recommended an immediate review of command structure. While the spill was brought under control, a secondary alert triggered at a hospital where the brownout had stalled life support systems between power cycles, and the response routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The guard authorized additional support, and the convoy began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the market he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to free a generator housing that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and shifted it into place without comment, and the hum of backup power steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The surgical team moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a revised directive that would redefine operational leadership across federal responses, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an emergency review. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a nurse pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras. The guard's presence should have simplified jurisdiction, yet the footage that circulated internationally suggested a different hierarchy emerging in real time, because the stabilization at the freight yard had coincided with an unaffiliated intervention rather than a military deployment. Vaught's overseas affiliates began requesting guidance when a refinery in Toronto reported a containment anomaly that local heroes found partially resolved by a man matching Saitama's description, and a port authority in Rotterdam transmitted clips of a cargo spill that settled without corresponding equipment use. The global dashboard populated with incidents that did not align with deployment schedules, and the liaison warned that narrative drift abroad could affect domestic authority at a moment when the city's grid had not yet recovered. Ashley authorized a statement that would emphasize partnership across borders, even as legal requested an injunction to prevent unauthorized footage from being broadcast. Back in Manhattan, a transit hub reported a full signal loss that stalled trains between stations, and the evacuation routed through both municipal and federal oversight as guard units redirected to assist. Maeve coordinated with engineers to clear a platform where emergency lighting had not engaged, and A-Train secured a path through an intersection that now cycled randomly. Homelander departed with the expectation that a visible rescue would restore sequence, and the cameras framed the stairwell with the anticipation of a lift that would trend. Saitama arrived because the road toward the next open market passed beneath the hub, and he paused when he saw a group of commuters trying to pry open a jammed carriage door. He asked if they needed help and pulled it free enough to clear the platform without comment, and the emergency lighting steadied as if the load had been redistributed. Maeve noticed the change before the sensors did and moved to guide the crowd through while guard personnel shouted for distance, and Homelander's hand on the railing found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as international networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and the liaison advised that the integration order might now be interpreted as an admission of dependence. The mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the analytics team reported a further dip in sentiment across multiple markets. A train watched the platform footage and noted that the man did not appear to understand why anyone was filming him. While the hub evacuation cleared, a secondary alert triggered at a coastal shipping lane where a container vessel had lost steering and was drifting toward a crowded pier, and the response routed through national coordination with guard support. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through traffic that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transit route had been closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a dockworker struggling to release a mooring line that had jammed under tension. He asked if they needed help and pulled it free without comment, and the vessel's drift slowed as if the load had been redistributed. The dockworkers moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a revised advisory that would redefine operational leadership across national responses, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an immediate policy update. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a crew chief pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras. Vought responded the way empires respond when their center is questioned, by asserting control loudly and often, because noise can be a kind of authority when facts blur, and the first public move was not negotiation but containment. Homelander staged a show of force above the district where the man in the yellow suit had walked through a dozen rescues without taking a contract, and the cameras that had once filmed his entrances now circled like curious satellites, catching a descent that read on every channel as escalation rather than reassurance. Ashley Barrett coordinated messaging from a command van parked on the periphery, instructing legal to push for an emergency injunction and PR to roll out a narrative that framed any resistance as chaos. The intent was to replace doubt with an ordered script, and the field teams moved with the speed of people trained to make effects look inevitable. The first containment squad advanced with armored rigs and experimental nets designed by Vaught's research wing, and the public watched through feeds that no longer seemed able to decide whether they were witnessing protection or prosecution. On the street, Queen Maeve took position with a practical brutality that had been choreographed for camera-friendly containment, while A-Train's blur flanked the block to prevent escape routes. They meant to show that a civilian, even an inconveniently effective one, could be corralled into affiliation or custody if the company and its heroes declared it necessary. The field techs deployed a layered stasis frame under the idea that physical restraint would be less dramatic than headline-making force, and the rig's sensors whirred as they attempted to lock a perimeter the way a surgeon clamps a vessel. Saitama, who had been inspecting a display of discounted canned goods 2 blocks away, wandered into the deployment area because a convenience store had opened a new oven to lure customers inside. He put a hand on a shelf to steady himself when a gust from A-Train's past knocked over a stack of boxed snacks, and the casual contact with the rig's stabilization sensors read like feedback to a machine that had expected resistance, not the contentment of someone asking if the coupon would still apply. Resistance showed up in ways that were not strategic because it was not yet organized. It came as hesitation in the eyes of a rookie handler who had been ordered to loop a net around a man who was asking staff whether the bakery's sample was free. And it came as a refusal from a mid-level soup on Homelander's flank, who delayed in advance long enough for social feeds to amplify the picture of an unthreatening civilian under an armed perimeter. Starlight, a public face who still carried residual goodwill, hovered on the observation feed and asked a question that was not meant to be broadcast but was. Is this necessary? The question leaked into commentary and then into protests, because when a hero asks whether force is required, an audience interprets it as permission to doubt. A handful of bystanders stepped forward, not to attack Vought but to sit with the yellow-suited man and block the line of approach, and their presence did what footage could not. It forced boots and armor to confront bodies rather than pixels. The attempt at dominance failed on 2 fronts at once: equipment and will. The experimental nets that had been touted as non-lethal restraint caught the air in a way the engineers had not predicted, tightening around invisible loads until the frame declared an error and shut down to avoid catastrophic strain. At the same time, word-of-mouth and on-the-ground cameras broadcast the image of Vaught's heroes pushing against citizens to detain a man who'd been helping people. And the public's reaction spilled from comments into streets as small clusters of protesters moved in to challenge tape and ask questions that the legal team could not paper over. A municipal judge on call refused to rubber stamp the emergency affidavit without a clearer probable cause statement, and the injunction that would have greenlit a hard arrest stalled, while the legal language got rewritten for the 3rd time in 2 hours. Vaught's planned reassertion of control, which had been designed to be decisive, mutated into a bureaucratic tangle at the same moment that empathy and outrage created a human buffer. The escalation that made resistance irreversible did not come from the protesters or from Saitama. It arrived as a technological recoil when Vought ordered the stasis frame to increase amplitude to compensate for the net failure, and the resulting harmonics overloaded a substation on the block. The transformer popped with a sound that registered like a gunshot in the feed, and the outage cascaded down primary feeders into hospitals and traffic nodes that were already strained by the day's brownouts. Emergency services that had been coordinating with Vought found their radios hopping between frequencies and their dispatch algorithms returning conflicting priorities, and a unit assigned to the downtown grid reported a simultaneous failure in 2 redundant paths that had been rated to never fail together. Where dominant action had been intended to restore order, it instead produced a new layer of harm. Critical infrastructure faltered in a way that could not be blamed on a single actor and could not be fixed with a press release. Saitama shifted a few paces to avoid a shower of sparks from an overhead line and asked, very plainly, if anyone could tell him whether the nearby bakery's sample was still warm, because he had been walking for groceries. The question landed like an anticlimax after a string of failed control measures, and the cameras that had been trained to capture a takedown now transmitted a tableau that made Vought look both heavy-handed and incompetent. In the command van, Ashley's face moved from professional composure toward the calculation of contingency plans, while Homelander hovered above the crowd with a posture that implied readiness if not certainty, and legal drafted emergency language that could not yet be filed because the judges on call were receiving conflicting reports. The crowd's mood shifted from protest to something harder to quantify: expectation. Not just that Saitama might be spared, but that institutions would now be held to account for the damage they caused trying to make him comply. The block's lights went dark in a pattern that would take crews hours to reverse, and in that blackout, the scene stopped being a brand exercise and became a field where policy, technology, and public will had already collided. The stasis frame's error light still blinked where it had overloaded the grid, and the protesters who had once been hesitant now moved to protect equipment from looting while demanding answers from officials. The attempt to assert dominance had produced resistance that was not ephemeral but structural. Legal proceedings would begin, technical audits would be demanded, and the public trust that underpinned the Seven's cultural authority had been punctured in a way that could not be re-glued with a campaign. Saitama, meanwhile, shrugged and stepped into the bakery because the sample was warm, and he had not yet decided the day was interesting enough to make a scene, leaving a containment exercise that had failed upward into a crisis, already rolling toward the federal level. The morning after the stasis frame failure, the city's mood had the texture of a place that had been promised safety and received new rules instead. And the first responders who had once trusted equipment now spent their shifts tracing error chains rather than saving time. Homelander hovered above the district with the posture of someone trained to close a book on panic. But even his presence could not turn off the quiet argument between utility engineers and field techs about why a secondary feed had collapsed when the containment rig drew spike after spike. Queen Maeve moved through the perimeter with the mechanical assurance that comes from practice, her gestures calming civilians, while she privately asked her handlers whether the rig's safety interlocks had been tested with live grid topologies. A train cut across avenues to accelerate ambulance corridors where generators had failed, and as he relayed coordinates to crews, the first hard consequence of the containment misfire became visible on the incident board. A surgical wing had lost power mid-procedure, and backup switchover had stalled long enough to produce an outcome no one on a live feed wanted to see. The image of a hospital corridor holding still around a patient who did not survive the blackout traveled faster than any press release, and Starlight's urgent request to pull the feeds from channels where bereaved families were visible translated into a moral problem the brand team could not edit out. Ashley Barrett's legal counsel convened with crisis advisors to draft language that would reframe the overload as an anomaly rather than policy, while city officials demanded an immediate audit of Vaught's field techs and equipment. Homelander's public posture shifted from command to damage control as he agreed to a televised briefing, but the footage editors found that no amount of camera angles could erase the memory of medics working by lamplight, while feeds circled images of the same yellow-suited man walking past a bakery. The public reaction rippled from grief into anger, which is a faster current than PR can paddle against, and protest organizers who had been hesitant a day earlier now coordinated marches to the tower with a speed born of outrage. From the tower's perspective, the containment failure had revealed a systemic vulnerability. Vaught's deployed rigs relied on microgrid assumptions that the city's aging infrastructure could not guarantee when loads oscillated unpredictably, and the liability calculus changed the moment a life was lost. A train's feeds fed into an operations room where engineers argued for immediate hardware recall, while the research wing pushed for a software patch that would require field crews to take rigs offline, an action that would leave precincts without a tactical option for containment. Ashley authorized a compromise: pull the experimental nets and maintain visible patrols, because optics mattered even when the technical fix was incomplete, and legal prepared for subpoenas from municipal council. Homelander watched the legal language and asked whether a voluntary recall could be framed as caution rather than failure. But the mayor's office had already requested federal oversight, and the Department of Homeland Security signaled an interest that meant the story was leaving the comfort of corporate control. On the ground, the resistance that had begun as human shields morphed into something closer to civic infrastructure. Volunteer crews began marking weak transformers with tape, and digital volunteers published maps showing which hospitals had confirmed generator health. And those crowdsourced tools rerouted ambulances around danger before official channels could respond. Maeve leaned into that network, moving through crowds to find the people who were trying to help rather than to push them back. And the cameras caught her handing a radio to a neighborhood organizer with a look that felt like permission. The sight of a public hero empowering civilians was not the image Vaught's PR had budgeted for, because it undercut the message that only corporate-trained subs could be trusted in emergencies. Homelander felt that loss of narrative authority as a physical pressure, and his handlers briefed him to use a softer message of collaboration during the evening address, even as federal investigators on call prepared dispatch orders to secure Vaught's experimental hardware for forensic analysis. The irreversible escalation arrived in layers. First, the human loss in the hospital that would not be undone. Then the legal cascade as municipal council issued emergency subpoenas. And finally, the political shift when a state senator filed a bill hours later to restrict private supers from deploying experimental weaponry without municipal certification. The bill's language sought to redefine public safety in terms that would criminalize unsanctioned field experiments, and committee staffers noted that the empirical case for such legislation had arrived in a day, both dramatic and simple. A life lost during a corporate containment exercise. In the command van, Ashley watched the text circulate and realized that even a carefully worded recall could not erase the political appetite for oversight. And Homelander was briefed that the next public appearance would be less about optics and more about testimony, because the city and the state now treated the incident as evidence rather than narrative. Outside, Saitama finished his sample, shrugged at a volunteer offering water, and walked down an avenue that was already sealed by police barriers as federal vans began to park on the perimeter. Federal oversight did not arrive as a courtroom summons, but as a convoy, because when municipal subpoenas intersected with a live operational footprint, jurisdiction shifted from paper to presence, and the first vans that parked along the perimeter carried more engineers than agents. Homeland Security requested immediate access to the containment rigs that had been deployed during the stasis attempt, and the field techs who had once operated under Vaught's proprietary protocols now found themselves explaining hardware to auditors who did not care about brand equity. Homelander watched the arrival from above with a composure that had always translated into reassurance. Yet the sight of federal markings where corporate logos once dominated signaled a transfer of authority that no speech could reverse. Ashley Barrett's voice moved through earpieces with instructions to cooperate without conceding fault, while legal began drafting the language that would define compliance as partnership rather than admission. On the street, Queen Maeve moved between guard units and volunteer crews to keep evacuation corridors open, and A-Train relayed coordinates to ambulances rerouted around substations that had not yet recovered from the overload. Starlight's feed from a community center showed residents sleeping on cots beneath emergency lighting, and the cameras that had once trended rescues now lingered on the absence of power in neighborhoods that had not been designed to share a failure. The human cost of the blackout was no longer abstract, because the hospital loss had been confirmed, and the family's statement circulated faster than any corporate response. When Homelander descended to offer reassurance, the applause that had once followed his arrival did not materialize. The next escalation arrived from the grid itself, when a synchronization fault propagated along a transmission line that had been manually rerouted to compensate for the earlier overload, and the resulting oscillation threatened to trip a dam spillway system upstream. Federal engineers requested immediate stabilization, while Municipal Command routed the response through both guard support and Vaught's air assets, because failure at the spillway would flood a downstream district already strained by evacuations. Maeve coordinated with site crews to clear access to the manual override, and A-Train secured a route through traffic that had begun to ignore the lights again. Homelander departed with the expectation that a visible intervention would restore sequence. Saitama arrived because the road toward the next open store passed beneath the dam's service entrance, and he paused when he saw a maintenance crew struggling to engage a gate that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the oscillation in the line softened as if the system had decided to wait. Maeve noticed the change before the monitors did, and moved to confirm the override while engineers shouted for clearance, and Homelander's hand on the railing found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction that would now arrive too late to matter. The federal liaison advised that the synchronization fault had been arrested before the spillway completed its cycle, and the analytics team reported that the public was beginning to treat unaffiliated intervention as the true response. A train watched the maintenance crew move past Saitama without recognizing him, and he reported that the cameras remained pointed in the wrong direction. Back at the tower, the political cost became tangible when the state senator's bill gained co-sponsors within hours, and committee staffers scheduled an emergency hearing that would examine private soup deployment during municipal crises. Ashley authorized a legal defense that would emphasize adaptive response, while Homelander prepared for testimony that would not be mediated by PR. The Guard requested additional support as the blackout threatened to propagate again, and federal engineers warned that the manual reroute could not hold through the night. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras as investigators began to photograph the containment rigs. The spillway remained stable, but the hearing date had been set, and the convoy did not leave when the immediate crisis passed. The emergency hearing was scheduled before the grid had fully stabilized, which meant that testimony would be gathered in the middle of an operational crisis rather than after the fact, and that timing shifted the balance from narrative to evidence in a way Vought had rarely faced. Federal engineers remained on site at the dam to monitor the manual override that had arrested the oscillation, while municipal command rerouted evacuation corridors around substations that still reported intermittent faults. Homelander was briefed on the scope of the inquiry with language that emphasized cooperation, yet the inclusion of casualty reports in the committee's request for documentation made it clear that this would not be a routine oversight session. Ashley Barrett authorized the release of limited deployment logs to demonstrate transparency, even as legal prepared to challenge the admissibility of footage captured by civilians. On the ground, Queen Maeve coordinated with Guard units to maintain access to a water treatment facility, where a secondary valve failure threatened to flood a low-lying district. An A-Train relayed coordinates to ambulances navigating streets that had begun to cycle randomly again. Starlight's feed from a shelter showed families waiting for updates beneath emergency lighting, and the cameras that had once trended rescues now lingered on the absence of power in neighborhoods that had not been designed to share a failure. The human cost of the blackout expanded when a second hospital reported complications linked to delayed generator switchover, and the incident board updated with a notation that would follow Vought into every future hearing. The next escalation arrived from a communications hub, where the brownout had disrupted signal relays that coordinated emergency services across the boroughs, and the response routed through both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that restoring the hub would prevent further delays in medical response, and A-Train secured a path through traffic that had only just returned to normal operation. Homelander departed with the intent to reframe the intervention as a joint effort under federal supervision. Saitama arrived because the road he had taken toward an open store passed beneath the hub's service entrance, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to reseat a relay that had slipped under load. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the signal steadied as if the system had decided to wait. Maeve noticed the change before the monitors did and moved to confirm the restoration while engineers shouted for clearance. And Homelander's hand on the panel found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction that would now arrive too late to matter. The federal liaison advised that the relay had stabilized before the backup cycle completed, and the analytics team reported that the public was beginning to treat unaffiliated intervention as the true response. A train watched the technicians move past Saitama without recognizing him, and he reported that the cameras remained pointed in the wrong direction. Back at the tower, the political cost became tangible when the state senator's bill advanced out of committee within hours, and staffers scheduled a vote that would restrict private soup deployment during municipal crises. Ashley authorized a legal defense that would emphasize adaptive response, while Homelander prepared for testimony that would not be mediated by PR. The Guard requested additional support as the blackout threatened to propagate again, and federal engineers warned that the manual reroute could not hold through the night. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras as investigators began to photograph the containment rigs. The relay remained stable, but the vote had been scheduled, and the hearing date did not move when the immediate crisis passed. The hearing did not wait for sunrise, because when infrastructure becomes evidence, the calendar compresses to match the urgency of risk, and Homelander found himself seated beneath fluorescent lights that flattened his practiced expressions into something the committee could parse. Ashley Barrett's counsel framed the day's deployments as adaptive response to an unprecedented cascade, yet the inclusion of the hospital loss in the opening statement shifted the conversation from tactics to consequence in a way that could not be softened by brand language. Federal engineers presented load traces from the stasis frame's amplitude spike, and the municipal grid operator described how the oscillation had propagated into a spillway system upstream that nearly flooded a district already under evacuation. Queen Maeve's testimony focused on field conditions, A-trains on perimeter control, and starlights on the shelters that had filled when power failed, and the combined narrative began to describe not a sequence of saves, but a chain of harm that had been triggered by an attempt at containment. Outside the chamber, the city continued to behave like a system that had been nudged out of tolerance, and a secondary transmission fault reported along a feeder that supplied two hospitals forced municipal command to consider rolling blackouts to preserve surgical capacity. Guard units moved to support substations that had begun to cycle again, and federal liaison officers relayed requests for assistance that now routed through Joint Command rather than Vaught's proprietary channels. Homelander's handlers briefed him on the optics of cooperation, but the committee's questions had already established a different frame: whether private SUPs should be allowed to deploy experimental equipment in municipal crises without certification. The escalation that transformed oversight into intervention arrived when the same feeder fault interacted with a delayed generator switchover at a trauma center 3 districts away, and the response routed through national coordination with Guard support. Maeve moved to secure access to the manual transfer panel, while A-Train cleared a route through traffic that had begun to ignore the lights again, and the liaison confirmed that the revised protocols would apply to medical responses. Homelander departed with the expectation that a visible restoration would counterbalance testimony. Saitama arrived because the road he had taken toward an open store passed beneath the trauma center's service entrance, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to free a housing that had jammed under load. He asked if they needed help, and shifted it into place without comment, and the hum of backup power steadied as if the system had decided to wait. Maeve noticed the change before the monitors did, and moved to confirm the transfer while engineers shouted for clearance. And Homelander's hand on the panel found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction that would now arrive too late to matter. The federal liaison advised that the transfer had stabilized before the backup cycle completed, and the analytics team reported that the public was beginning to treat unaffiliated intervention as the true response. A train watched the technicians move past Saitama without recognizing him, and he reported that the cameras remained pointed in the wrong direction. Back in the chamber, the committee chair noted the restoration in real time and asked whether municipal teams had coordinated with Vought on the manual transfer, and the liaison replied that the assistance had come from an unaffiliated responder under the temporary integration order. The question that followed, whether that responder had been directed by the Seven, landed with a weight that no press briefing could absorb, because the answer was already visible on the feeds. Ashley authorized a final statement that would emphasize cooperation, while Homelander prepared for a vote that would redefine deployment authority. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a nurse pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras as the committee recessed to draft language. The trauma center remained stable, but the bill advanced to the floor, and the hearing did not adjourn when the immediate crisis passed. The vote was scheduled before the city had finished counting the night's outages, because when a failure becomes policy, the remedy moves at legislative speed rather than engineering pace, and the chamber filled with staffers carrying incident logs instead of press kits. Ashley Barrett's legal team positioned the day's interventions as adaptive cooperation, yet the committee's summary placed the hospital loss alongside the stasis frame, overload as paired evidence that private deployment had crossed from assistance into hazard. Homelander listened from a side room with a composure trained for cameras that were no longer present, and the language advancing to the floor described a permanent restriction on experimental equipment in municipal crises without certification. Queen Maeve monitored field feeds, while A-Train coordinated with guard units to maintain access to substations that still cycled under rerouted load, and Starlight's shelter reports updated the casualty board with a second complication linked to delayed generator transfer. Outside, the city's infrastructure behaved like a system that had been told to hold its breath, and a final synchronization fault reported along a feeder that supplied a pediatric wing forced municipal command to consider controlled shutdowns to preserve surgical capacity. Guard units moved to support a manual transfer that had jammed under pressure, and federal liaison officers relayed requests for assistance that now routed through joint command rather than Vaught's proprietary channels. Homelander's handlers briefed him on the optics of testimony, but the bill's sponsors had already secured enough votes to advance the measure beyond committee. The escalation that sealed the outcome arrived when the same feeder fault interacted with a delayed switchover at the pediatric wing, and the response routed through national coordination with guard support. Maeve moved to secure access to the manual transfer panel, while A-Train cleared a route through traffic that had begun to ignore the lights again, and the liaison confirmed that the revised protocols would apply to medical responses without exception. Homelander departed with the expectation that a visible restoration would counterbalance the floor debate. Saitama arrived because the road he had taken toward an open store passed beneath the wing's service entrance, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to reseat a housing that had slipped under load. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the hum of backup power steadied as if the system had decided to wait. Maeve noticed the change before the monitors did, and moved to confirm the transfer while engineers shouted for clearance. and Homelander's hand on the panel found that it no longer required the same effort to hold. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction that would now arrive too late to matter. The federal liaison advised that the transfer had stabilized before the backup cycle completed, and the analytics team reported that the public was beginning to treat unaffiliated intervention as the true response. A train watched the technicians move past Saitama without recognizing him, and he reported that the cameras remained pointed in the wrong direction. Back in the chamber, the floor vote passed with a margin that would not be reversed on appeal, and the statute immediately restricted private soup deployment during municipal crises without certification. Ashley authorized a compliance statement that would redefine Vaught's role in proximity terms, while Homelander prepared for a future in which arrival no longer implied authority. Maeve noted that the footage from the pediatric wing showed stabilization without corresponding equipment deployment, and the liaison recommended an immediate policy update. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a nurse pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras as investigators began to catalog the containment rigs. The wing remained stable, but the statute had taken effect, and the Seven's authority to deploy in the next crisis now required permission that might arrive too late. The world did not return to normal because oversight had replaced spectacle, and the next emergency would begin without waiting for a hero to be cleared for entry.